Hello? Yes? Okay, it's working. Thank you to everyone I forced to come out here. I used to live in Paris, and I'm so happy to see people I've seen here for about 15 years. I'm really excited to read with Adrienne, who I know from Brooklyn, and it feels a little bit surreal to be here in a completely different place. We decided to do something a little bit different tonight. We decided we were going to choose 4 words, and then each of us was going to read a poem based on the word and then have a really brief discussion about it. And I say 4 because I love poetry and even I need to know when it's going to be over. And so it's a good way for you just to be schematic in your head and be like, okay, this is moving along, right? And so I'm going to introduce the first word, which is humiliation and regret. Yes, / regret. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I'm a professor. I teach students a lot about emotional affects and also synonyms. So like I would ask them, like, how would you write a poem about humiliation versus embarrassment? Right. And like humiliation, maybe having more of like a social banishment quality to it, rather embarrassment, maybe having like a kind of short-lived like temporality or something like that. And so I thought that would be a great place to start. Humiliation, everyone can relate to it. If you haven't yet, you haven't been living, and welcome, it's going to start soon. So can I ask you to get us started with that poem?
Can you hear me okay? And first of all, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out tonight and the folks online. And thank you, first and foremost, the American Library in Paris for having me all month. And the month is already flying. It's really magical to be here and be with these people in this space and with all you people. And also, Megan, it's so good to have you here. It's so good to see you here and in Paris. And also, everybody really needs to buy Megan's book yesterday. It's astonishingly good. It's so sharp. It's really sticking with me. I have so many questions about it. But I will start with humiliation / regret. / embarrassment, maybe. There's so many valences to that. And I'm going to start with actually the title poem of this collection, Our Dark Academia, which came out this fall. And the title poem, Our Dark Academia, I'll just read it first, and then we'll go from there. Our Dark Academia. In my ears, the girls are just learning they are witches, blowing out candles with their minds, fluttering lights, making cakey makeup melt off the jealous ones to moon-fed fleshy faces, pockmarked constellations. Our quartet, Brooke, Vivian, Louise, Sylvia, our dark academia, Artemis aesthetic, perfect skin. They're getting bitchier. They lean into it, burn the pillowcases with lacy cigarette butts. And when the prefect, this is British boarding fantasy, rotting vines, menstrual blood, challenges at lights out, they point as one to a sneak smoke by the matron doing laundry on a Sunday, which is the Lord's work. They all, of course, share a secret, which the rest of us would die to know, and so I sacrifice myself. Today, waiting, hands chapped, stomped feet at the reflecting pool, me tiptoeing to stare at their eyes in the water. I can hear them, but they can't me. I'm not real to them in the way that they're too real. In the way they step back and it's not a reflecting pool, but a deer, round bloke eye rolling crazily out of its socket, in the way of everything, but don't touch it. All of them long dead in that first pandemic winter. So I make them live it again and again, and I put on their blazers and smooth my face into theirs. This past will overtake us because it already is.
That was beautiful. And also, usually I'm like, please don't clap because they're so sad, a lot of these poems, and it feels like you're being like, everything is going to be fine, but everything will be fine, and we should clap, and
Or everything won't be fine.
or everything won't be fine, and that's why we need it more.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read my humiliation poem, and then we're going to have a little conversation. My humiliation poem is literally called "Do You Sell Dignity Here?" And it's about a time when I was like really just like everything was the lowest of the low. And I went to a grocery store and I was like, "Do you sell dignity here?" And he was like, are you okay? It's a very New York poem. "Do you sell dignity here? Do you know what aisle they sell dignity?" I say to the store clerk on University Avenue. It is a cold October. Frank Ocean's Moon River croons in my head. And earlier that day, I lay flat in the bathtub like a wild infant, shower pouring, thinking of that Dickinson poem where she says, "A bomb upon the ceiling is an improving thing. Steam gathering in celestial curls, and I imagine bombs fizzing out gas and me radioactive with love." At the grocery store, I ask where they sell dignity, and when the clerk says, "Sorry, what'd you say?" I explained that I'm looking for dignity, having lost so much in the last year, and was wondering if it was neatly placed by the baking powder or perhaps refrigerated with the perishables given its fragile shelf life. And yes, I really did ask this, partly because I was being funny and trying to make a friend, but also I would have taken a hug or any acknowledgement that I am a person who can laugh at myself despite walking with that odd angle of defeat. Children have no dignity, and I really admire that about them. I love their ruthless response to injustices, their desire to feed birds in the park, to grieve the sea, their right to be tired in public. "Do you sell dignity here?" I asked one last time, and then tell them how it went down, how I had lost mine in Bushwick, of all places, near a building covered in glass and white girl gentrifiers having their white girl epiphanies, such bad coming of age trash. "Jesus, all my parents' sacrifices for this, for what? Is this why I came here from Africa?" they would say over my flat body, hopefully in the shape of a shrug. I am undignified. I prey on fluorescent light. I enter through the automatic door of grocery stores with royal glide, feetless into an even white. I greet peaches and body cauliflower, nod to the pink packets of sweeteners and wrapped meat thighs. I am drawn to the milks and oblong fruit, dent a red Campbell's can of soup. I want everything as cheap and damaged as this feeling. "When they go low, we go high," a president's wife said. "I go low some days. I go so low, you cannot tell me from the animals we sell, from the hard grain my body has become." So yeah. See how I prompted you to clap before I read my poem? That was very strategic. Yeah.
We get it.
So I chose this and I loved the poem that you read, and particularly I loved the mention of Artemis and Louise and the sort of bringing in of these kind of archetypal female figures from history. And one thing you learn when obviously you're reading about this is just all the different ways every woman has been humiliated, regardless of being a deity or not. And so I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Or anything, because I didn't prompt you for that question. I don't want you to feel like it's coming out of nowhere.
No. And also I have so many questions about your poem. It's so great. And just well, just to answer that thought about archetypes, and this book is thinking a lot about archetypes and playing with what does it mean to kind of put on a character and put on a facade. And I mean, this book, just to give a little bit of background about it and about because it's maybe helpful to know, a background to this book is I wrote much of it in a deep pandemic moment. I was doing a poem a day exercise with our friend, the poet Sarah Denizakand, and we were doing this as poem a day, and she had brought the idea to me, and she had done it with other people. But anyway, it was I was starting to write. She was starting to write a bunch of these poems that were all cohering around a certain figure who's very different than it's sort of one figure, a Fanta figure, and then my poems were sort of there are a lot of female or female coded figures in the book, and they kind of float in and out of each other, and the names are really like both crucial and not. Like there's Artemis, there's Louise. I think in this like very first poem I wanted to play with those names that were like, here's this kind of mask, or here's this costume, here's this outfit you're putting on, and when you put on an Artemis outfit, who do you become? When you put on a Louise outfit, do you become Louise Bourgeois? Do you become Louise Brooks? Do you become Sylvia Plath when you put on the name Sylvia Plath? Or are you never going to live up to that name? Or are you just always going to be something else? So I was always, I've been thinking or kind of feeling a lot about that, of wanting to both embody these deity like figures, but and also disappear and lose yourself in them. And there's something so seductive about every time you kind of arrive at a new name, you can be a new person, but then you can never be either. It's like, every time you put on a new skin, are you shedding the old skin, or are you just kind of like putting that new skin on top of it. And so that's, I think, a lot of what I was playing with here.
Yeah, I love that. Also, I think there's something like that's a little bit like persona oriented about that, right? Like we think about persona and like dramatic monologue as taking on a voice for a whole poem, kind of embodying that space. There's been a lot of conversation recently about like appropriation and what we like make when we ventriloquize like a certain historical figure.
It's really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's really deeply uncomfortable to become Artemis in a poem, and it's really deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the appropriation and what spaces we're entering. Yeah.
And I was gonna say, like, also thinking about like Dickinson, I realized something recently, which is that I guess I'm dragging Emily Dickinson in like 50% of all of my poems, which is not popular because everyone loves Emily Dickinson. You can't say anything about her that's bad, but that she's a very precise poet, and there's something against the unruly about her work. And that always pissed me off when I was growing up. She was one of the two poets I ever had on my shelf was like Khalil Gibran and Dickinson, thinking about like, you know, these sort of deity or like legacy poets we've had in our lives. And she was so every syllable mattered in a way that always felt like there was something about the economy that felt like kind of like offensive to me. You
It's
know,
really funny because I find Emily Dickinson incredibly
messy.
permissive in her
Really?
messiness. Yeah. Well, no, but it's
Go
like
back
her
and read it.
form is super messy because she's like, oh, I'm gonna like take this like rando like this is like, okay, I'm gonna do this scrap and then I'm gonna like crumple it. I'm gonna mess it up and then I'm gonna like write a little poem on it, maybe. And then I'll like toss it off and I'll like also make a scrapbook of like her scrapbook of pressed leaves is both super precise and super messy. I think that I find her
The
work
scrapbookness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you're
Yeah.
redeeming her a little bit about for me, but there's something I think like because there were those two, right? You have like this one long ceremonial poet who is like, I'm going to talk about everything. And then there was something about like my interiority is so messy, as you can hear from the poem.
Yeah.
So like there's something so precise about that interiority that I just love, but also hate to love. If that makes sense.
And then also I think Dickinson is like also relevant. And then I want to ask about your poem and then move on to I have so many things, but
We're just talking to each other, actually.
Yeah. No, but I think Dickinson is also really interesting in this idea of a canon and how do poets get received over time too, because you know, famously Dickinson, when she's published she published 7 poems in her lifetime, and then she doesn't get published with the proper punctuation until the 50s. And so at first she reads like a very standard Victorian poet, because if you just publish her without her dashes in it, she just it reads like a yeah, exactly. And so then and then but you're right, there's then this kind of reverse, like really precise, like, oh, then we always have to revere Dickinson in this way. And I think to me a more exciting answer lies in the middle with her humanness somehow. And that's why I kind of love her scraps and her weirdness and her, like, you know, there's secretly in her, in the like, yeah, like in her like pressed leaf book, there's kind of quietly, like she labels a lot of the like flowers that she presses. She was really into pressing flowers. She labels a lot of them really precisely. There's Latin names, and then there's just like a random leaf sitting there, and it's definitely a marijuana leaf, and she definitely doesn't label it. So I'm just gonna put it out there, Emily Dickinson.
Redeeming. Maybe a pothead. We heard it here first.
Speaking of transgression, would you like to read a transgression poem?
Oh, yes, that was our next thing.
Yeah.
Which is also to say that we came up with 4. The first is humiliation, the second was transgression.
Yeah.
The third is obsession, and our last was thinking about legacy. So just know what's up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, what to read for this one. And I'm thinking about reading this poem that I think is something we all kind of want, which is to sort of meet somebody on an airplane that we vibe with.
Yeah.
And this is, and also I'm a strong believer in astrology. Are there any Tauruses here? So, all right, get out, everyone. I'm just kidding. Any Sagittariuses? Oh, cool. Okay, love Sages, right? So I was sitting on a plane with someone, and this is a poem I wrote called Sagittarius. On the plane to Zurich, you tell me you've recently moved your birthday to June. When I ask, how does one move their birthday? You say you've always felt you deserve to be born in summer. While you're talking, I can't believe my luck that we've been seated together at random since I spotted you at the gate and thought the drum in your ear was beating faster than the world. You say, I used to have psychological problems, but now that's all settled, as if you just closed a deal on a house. When you pull out a sleep mask studded in blue rhinestones and announce your bedtime routine while singing Prince and everyone in our row stares, I steady your giant box of cosmetics and think, oh my God, I'm in love with you, with anyone who can make a home of brevity or insist on a new season for their birth. Come see me in Vienna, you say, and I do, because I believe so much in being led. No, you don't have to say it's fair. Yeah. Your turn.
I love that. As a Sagittarius, born on the day of soaring imagination, I'll say that the most Sagittarius thing in the world is to say, I'm born in June. This is a poem of transgression called Felix by Proxy. We arranged to meet under the High Line outside the Whitney. I was running down from this photo shoot in Chelsea, so I had my clothes stuffed into a hiking backpack and I was naked except for stilettos. Felix was coming from choir practice. He was tall, very thin, ginger nut hair, a two-vest situation, naked below the knees. Hi, I said, glistening from the running. You must be Jay's friend, shall we fuck? The ginger nut didn't say anything, eyes white. I stuck out my hand. He looked at my updo. Hi, he said, I'm in 3 choirs. Did Jay tell you? One's way in Harlem. That's the one I like best. The other 2 down here, one at this church in Tribeca, the other one sort of midtown. He had this soft, moony Irish brogue. 2 women in actual pillbox hats, tweed suits, wheezed past me on their way into the museum. A bus divulged tourists. Another wave of day campers, day glow t-shirts. Wonderful, I said, shall we fuck on the High Line? He looked at the Hudson River. I'm 17. Fuck, I sighed. Okay. I shifted my backpack. The straps were cutting into me. I walked Felix to the 1 train. We parted, he to Harlem for rehearsal, I to my phone. At that point, Mar was just breaking up with Roman, the condom king. Could I have him? What happened with Jay's guy? Mar wrote back. Nope. I'm naked below 18th Street, I texted Roman, but he must have been underground. It didn't send. The line going from blue to green to red.
So both these poems seem like about trying to get laid in places you're not supposed to.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to ask you about like place and desire and how place shapes desire. And I think, we both live in New York. And that's like one vibe. And we were just saying this, and like every time I come to Paris, I'm always like, oh my God, I just want to like it's so much more sensual. Like people care about food more. I feel like I'm just like eating to get by in New York. I'm doing everything to get by in New York, to be fair. There's so much care for, like, a lack of better word, of like aesthetics and beauty and also history, where I feel like in New York, like there's so much amnesia in terms of like, particularly I think we were both there during the pandemic, and like so many terrible things happened, and the city was just trying to like move on really fast without mourning, because it was like this return to continuity and normalcy. So I don't know, however you want to answer that, place and desire, and also how place shapes like your sensibility, your aesthetics.
That's a great question. I want to hear your answer to it too. I think I have not spent that much time in Paris before this fellowship, and I've only been here for a week so far. And but I think there's something about, I know about Paris, and I've been here a little bit before, and I feel like I've been here in my mind so much, having read about it, having fantasized about it, having, read, you can't read every cliche about Paris, but sure, I read a lot of them. And I think that, but I think there also is something really magical about being in a place that you know in your mind, that you've been to in your imagination, you've been to through other people's imaginations, through art and history and architecture and literature. There's so much like depth and mythology to it. And then being here as an outsider and kind of feeling that outsiderness, but yeah, just kind of feeling the drift and the float of it. And you can't sort of help but suddenly being like, oh, I'm awake and alive to my senses in a way that I think a place where you know a lot better. And not that you're desensitized, but it's like you don't kind of rely on the tingling of your senses to like literally move you around a lot. So I think that there's something, and I find something just also incredibly stimulating in the ghost quality that Paris totally forefronts, and maybe like the most beautifully cliche way of like, yes, this is a street where like you are having your own solo experience. Like this morning, I found this, tucked away little alley. It was just like, the Rue Violette and some other like cross street. It was like, here's this like unmarked alley, and I'm going to walk down it, and I'm like, I'm the only person in the world who has ever had this experience before, and I am the millionth person to have had this experience before. And so I think that that is sort of the embodiment of place, but embodiment of like all of these ghosts and the outsiderness. Not a real answer, I'm just describing more.
No, but I loved hearing your poem about the High Line. If anybody's been to New York, the High Line Park, it is amazing the way in which like the poem is so infrastructural. Like you're in the subway and all of a sudden you can't communicate with someone. Sometimes that's like a relief, right? When you're just like, I texted you, I just need a minute, like I can't do it. But then like the High Line, which is like this really particular park in New York, which is not necessarily a people's park, it's like a privately owned park, right? And so there's something kind of like, it's not for people from New York, but then it also like is elevated and it feels like aestheticized and postcard, and yeah, I don't know, it's funny the way in which like the background of a place, regardless if it's happened to a million people, can still, you can be the biggest cynic in the world and be like, it's still romantic, and I love that about the poem and the way that it like disrupts it and makes it weird. I'm gonna ask you if you might read our next poem for transgression. Or no, sorry, transgression, obsession. I'm reading off a postcard. Yeah, bad handwriting.
So I would say maybe my poetics are obsession. I am a poet or a writer of obsession. So I'm gonna read a poem that leans into obsession, a particular kind of obsession, incredibly hard. It leans into obsession so hard that well, I'll just say that during the pandemic, I was really, a lot of my best friends and still are, were like inside my Peloton machine. So, midnight calisthenics. Hi, what's up? It's Chrissy. I'm so glad you decided to spend this journey with me. I will make this totally easy. Just listen to me. Do everything I say to do, and this will be totally easy. I need you to feel supported. I need you to get enough grit underneath. I need it to get gritty. It's cold this morning. I put on this half hoodie, which if you know me, you know I don't usually. Have you ever tried a bath bomb? It totally made my morning. I love it when you make time for yourself. Oh my God, you have a dog too? That is so sweet. Hold it. That's great. If you incorporate this into your routine, that's great. Or if this is your only workout of the day, good for you for getting moving, really. Good for you. If you don't have a dog, that's okay too. You're doing this for you. If you like this, check out more of me. I have a whole series of these on demand. Also, I have a book coming out. So great. I need you to hold on now. Hold it. Come on, you're on my toes. Come on now. 3, 2, 1. Okay, towel off, hydration station. Love it. Do you? That's a milestone. You know those things? Pumice stones. Oh my God, game changer. After this, you have to do a dry rub. You have to do a diffuser. You have to, we're back in the interval. Push it, go, hold it. Okay, that's the way. Yes, you're looking great. Just move up a little, suck it in. Yes, it's going to get real results. It's getting real. Yes, you chose to carve out this moment for you. No one else gets this time, just for you. Hey, I'm Chrissy. Thanks for joining this journey with me. I'll see you all the time.
I have done one Peloton class. At my
One
friend
too
Junie, who's here, I was like making eye contact with her the whole time. It is insanely hard, and you've really captured the affect of energy there. So I just wanted to say, spot on. Mine is not about Peloton, but it is about Russell Brand, who is a British comedian who writes self-help books. And I was saying this to some people, when you're in your 20s, you like look at Russell Brand books or like self-help books, and you're just like really like, this is so lame. And then when you're in your 30s, you're like, I will buy all of these. And this is really going to turn my life around. So this is the obsession poem. It's called Drive. Anybody listen to the Cars here? Any Cars listeners? Okay, one person. Yeah, God, yeah. Okay. I walk into a record store on Christmas Eve and the Cars are playing, so of course I think of you. In therapy, I learn words and box 3 days a week and read Russell Brand's book about being fucked, and for months cut out drinking and applied to divinity school and examined my life and the impossibility of you and I, and how I is a mirror and you is nothing but a projection of I, and I did try honestly. I recited cliches when language failed. I let my self-helping heart run ravenous at a buffet of cheap routines, and then came armed one day with my ancestors who had lived through revolutions and ships raging at their shores, and they too shrugged at me. So I blamed sexuality and childhood and made every target an easy one just to make it make sense, but it wouldn't fit, nothing fit, and my friends said words about history and race and power, and I wanted the pain to be ideological, but it was too easy, and nobody admits that ideology can envelop almost anything and therefore is bad form. I gave up. It was an angelic state, a surrender to a belief that you and I was a unity that could return one home if home were a pair of blue stars in devoted orbits seen as one bright pulse from Earth away from the brute facts of living. But home is not two suns. There is no home and nothing to return to, just a series of shadows, partial signs of presence, a flickering. I say things and then unsay them. It was love. It was not love. It is raining. It is not raining. Contradictions are a sign we are from God. We fall. We don't always get to ask why.
So I mean, this is gonna sound so. I want to ask you about like sentence structure too, and like lists and because I think about obsession and lists and kind of the run on. And I feel like that poem does this like, I mean, especially the way you read it accentuates it too. This I'm accumulating, and then we stop. Then we pause, then we stop, then we pause. And there's that kind of like rush and push and pull. So I'm so curious about kind of and so many of your poems sentences are kind of map all over the place. I'm so curious like how that also plays in with obsession for you.
So I'm pretty sure I have like ADHD. So that should be that's my poetics. And obsessiveness is a kind of like stream of consciousness where like you just can't stop thinking and the pause is not where you need it to be. You don't have a lot of rest. But then like it's kind of like I think sometimes in poetry there's a sort of epiphanic structure where you get to a volta, something shifts, and then it's like, and here we are, and you lay down and you're laying down next to the reader almost. And I've loved a lot of poets from sort of like the Black arts movement who are really kind of more sermonic in the way they're sort of storytelling, where it builds and it builds. And just when you think the epiphany is happening, there's a letdown. And the letdown is not rest. It's not quite rest. It's not quite a pause. And I think there's something about obsessiveness, right, which is deeply associative. No matter what you're doing, you're thinking about that person. No matter what you're like, you could be buying groceries, picking out apples, it's that person. Something, like when someone's on your mind, how every object becomes semiotically charged with them. And to me, that's like what obsession is when somebody is ubiquitously everywhere, and what that does to like your brain chemistry. It feels synaptic. The syntax then like kind of mirrors that, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think leads us to our last word beautifully. But also I think I wanted to say that obsession, I think the poems that both of us read have a hectic, addictive quality to them. And I think that there's versions of obsession that have that kind of the rabbit hole that gets faster and faster pace as you go down the vortex, and that's an addictiveness where everything then associates to it and it pulls you in and in. And I think that's related to, but not necessarily always the same thing as the obsession, where it's like everything gets tinged in that color, that or everything makes you think of that like I'm like a Sondheim nut, so there's like the song "Losing My Mind," like the like the sun comes up, I think about you. The coffee cup, I think about you. Like it's just like them think something. Do they know it's like I'm losing my mind? So it's like there's but it's the pace of a session that is the hectic pace, the addictive pace, and also the slow pace, the slow burn pace. But I wanted to ask you about before, because you mentioned Black Mountain Poets and you mentioned kind of like thinking through the legacies that you're drawing on that as a reader, whether or not you mention them explicitly or implicitly, like as a reader, I don't care. They're what's a poem that has ghost legacy in it? They all do, but
a lot of them. It's funny. So right after the borders opened after the pandemic, I went to see somebody in Venice that I, hadn't seen in a year, somebody really close to me. And because the pandemic had happened, nobody had gone to the graveyard in the middle where like Pound and Brodsky are buried. And I went and I saw Pound, and it was like, usually this would be like an altar, kind of like the Morrison grave here in Paris, where like people are like leaving, I don't know, like little poems or cigarettes or whatever. And it was completely covered in leaves and like just covered in slugs. And I had this moment of like, oh man, he's just such a fascist, but I got to clear this grave because I would clear any grave. And I've been thinking a lot also, just, as a woman as a queer woman of color, like what do I owe the dead? What's been important to me? I grew up loving Yeats and Rilke a lot, and like thinking about ways in which, why did they speak to me? How did I come up with it? And I think we have sometimes in the US a really unnuanced relationship with almost everything, let's be honest. But particularly with like history and with influence, and like not wanting to admit that a lot of us are Europeanists by training, as like Spivak says, right? And then what to do with that, right? And so this poem is a poem called Rilke, and it's from a translation, I think by Franz Wright, who really does something beautiful because he acknowledges that like it's about the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. And Rilke was really like, Eurydice knew he was going to turn around. So how do you reread that myth if you think she just went up there knowing she was going to turn right back around, and she had what he called a virginal indifference to Orpheus? And I just was obsessed with this. Like the dead don't care about us. And so this is also about a time I lost a job at a women's college to a man. So they're all revenge poems, let's be honest. So it's called Rilke, Already She Was Root. And that's a little epigraph from him. No one in history has ever been as smart as their husband. I think of the myths where men drown and women sit in the waiting rooms of the underworld. See, I think Orpheus knew. Had always planned to turn back, and Homegirl knew too. That's a kind of smart, to know what you know, to know what your man can and will do and how it will later be told. I prefer your kind of smart, my friend said, by which she means dumb joy. Hey, it's true. I flip Hades' den and get people in a room. I'm good at a party and even better at dead ends. When I lose a job at a woman's college to a dude, I mourn in gray silk for days, play Blanche in feigned distress, wander with cigarette holes in my dress, for character, to impress, to make sure I'm convincing enough to be overlooked. Once my students got locked in a room and I jumped from a window to let them out. What mama energy, one student said, and I gave her a C. Baby, I'm Circe. I hold down the island. I don't drown my own men in the sea. I tidy up the underworld, and down here there's a tunnel to hell where we wave each to each. We bury waterlogged peaches deep. We refuse to die in this underneath. When the detective breaks in and asks which way he went, I take a sip or drag. I pivot indifferent. I curtsy, ankles in check. I know how to turn around. I know who waits in this clockless eternity and who is allowed to drown. It's full of revenge poems. And they're all in the acknowledgements. I'm just kidding. That would be so messy. So I'm gonna ask you, what is your legacy beforeness?
My legacy beforeness. I mean, in a book called Our Dark Academia, it's all legacy. It's all before. We are all digging into the grave. So I'm gonna go with legacy on several levels. So this poem, I promise, is pretty short. It's the first legacy I'm thinking about is litany and list poems, and like there's this like incredible bonkers poet from the 1700s, it's Christopher Smart, who like basically he writes like a bunch of poems that are like four poems, and FOR, four poems. Like the famous one is like, "For I consider my cat Joffrey." If any of you guys have cats, just like read the cat Joffrey poem. It's so good. And then he has let poems. Anyway, this is like, so I love the kind of structure of the list poem, and I love that kind of like litany and the return to the sameness at the beginning. I'm also thinking about beforeness, also just like formally. This poem's got a lot of references in it, but I also kind of am constantly thinking about trivia and games, and the way that like trivia is constantly like making your brain jump to things that are like atemporal and then shoves them together. So it like kind of gives things meaning by putting them in the same place where they maybe like would never have gone before. So this is a poem. And I also am, like my brother comes in age like slightly before me, and he was a Jeopardy champion. So this poem is called Trebek Number 5. Also, I like Chanel. So, and we're in Paris. So Trebek number 5. What is among us? What is contact high? What is secondhand smoke? What is a Momofuku? Who is a Berenstein? What is East Berlin? What is Berlin, New Hampshire? What is Beetlejuice? What is a scab? What was the election of 1800? Is Mickey Mouse a dog or a cat? What is a Nickelodeon? What was a dime? What is a quarter tone? What is F flat? What is gluten? What is chaff? What is sunny delight? Who are sopranos? What is ivory? What is natural by nature? Who is Tennyson? What is the book of Job? What is job? What is KitchenAid? What is mother's little helper? What is the Mekong? Who is King Kong? Who is a mineral? What is not mine is mine? What is a mimeograph? What is a mom? Who among us has one? So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, Emily, but yeah.
We have a big round of applause first, please. Again. Lots of clapping tonight. Our hands are going to be sore. All right, we're going to open it up to questions first in the room, and then we'll turn to our Zoom audience as well. So if you have a burning question, now is your moment. Raise your hand very high so I can see it. Don't be shy. Yes, there's always has to be a first person.
Hi, good evening. If you both could each talk about kind of your creative process in writing poems. Adrienne, you mentioned doing a poem a day during the pandemic. Do you still do that, or how do you find inspiration? How long does it take you to revise a poem? If you could just kind of delve into that, I'd be really curious to know.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit more about that process. So writing this book, I didn't go into that project thinking I was gonna write a book either. I'll talk about that a little bit more because it was really helpful, and something that is always necessary for me is like writing is both a solitary and a social act. I need to write for people, for an audience, to a deadline, to whether the deadline is one person or an editor, or like a friend or an editor or somebody else. And also like poems can be the way that I speak to people. It's actually like I'm in writing groups like that poetry is, it's both like a sort of extremely solitary and actually quite a social language as well. So I want to kind of acknowledge that, because it's actually, I realized how important it is to, how do you kind of keep writing and thinking of poems? Well, it's to an audience or to an addressee, and the addressee might be in your head, but for this book, so during the pandemic, I started doing this poem a day project with a poet who I'm, close to. We went to graduate school together. We're continuing a writing group. She had done it with actually with a former fellow at the American Library. She had done this project with Hala Alian. So Hala, and sort of how Megan and I know each other too, because Sarah and Hala run a reading series together. So Sarah and Hala had done this poem a day, and then Sarah's was talking about it, was like, I said, we both just agreed to do a poem a day for 30 days, and it kind of extended a little longer. And the beauty of that was both in the dailiness and the kind of, we kept it on the same Google Doc, just so that then we were commenting on each other's poems. So we were having this dialogue in the comments, and then it wasn't actually, and at that point it wasn't at all editorial. It was mostly like inside jokes and riffing. And then it was also like, by about day 18, I was saying, wow, this is interesting. I'm seeing patterns in Sarah's work that she couldn't see in hers, and she was seeing patterns in mine that I wasn't able to see because we both had like enough of a distance. And then some of the stuff that in the comments kind of ended up in both of our work. The poems are like quite different. We're like they're very different, formally, aesthetically, what have you. But and that's great, I feel, because like then we were able to kind of have this dialogue. And also this book has a lot of poems that I wrote before that and after that, and a lot of revision to it. But I think the big point of this was having an audience, having somebody else out there. I realized during this project, during the pandemic especially, how vital that was to the way that I approach poems. And that was something I just like had kind of always known, I guess, intuitively, but it had never come up explicitly for me as much in process as in writing the poems that became the sort of bulk of this book. And then there's a lot of other things going on in that, but that's like one of the origin stories.
That's a great question, to which I have no really good answer, except to say that I feel like it's something I never tell my students, but unfortunately is true, is that I know if the poem hits in the first 10 minutes. It's like the first draft, I read it, I'm like, well, there it is. And sometimes when you revise so much and you just kind of you make it more beautiful, but you like beat the vitality out of it. And I think that there's something really, you have to figure out what your line is. For me, they come in spurts, and there's things that I do consistently that I think are important rituals. One of them is a kind of social aspect of it. But another thing that is like a ritual is just, I love stranger intimacy. So I just like love to like talk to random people, like my butcher or like my gynecologist or whatever, and just get like a lot of material. And I just think also that we're kind of in this moment of like being hyper professionalized in poetry, which is sad because poetry, I think, should be sort of outside of, hopefully, of a kind of professionalization. And so anything I think that you can also do when you're thinking about process to sort of push back at making, like, deciding what is routine, what is discipline. When we say you need to have discipline, like, we also have to think about like what we're trying to discipline in ourselves, and also trust part of yourself where the spaces where you're not that disciplined, because that actually is where a lot of the poetry is coming out of, is when we make mistakes, when we have sort of cognitive dissonance, when we have regret. I mean, just looking at these keywords, I'm like, oh God, humiliation, it's not great, like if we were super process oriented, and we had like rituals. I think prose writers are more like this. That's how you guys get so many things done, and also why you get nice advances, which is unknown to me. But I really do think like poetry is a little bit of like almost like a lifestyle, and to like kind of come at the world a little bit more of a slant, and not to fall too much into one process, one ritual, one discipline, because then the poems become kind of formulaic. Like there's a moment where I'm like, well, I know how to get out of this poem because I'm just going to do what I do, and then that's when like formal exercises or other kinds of constraints, which brings us to like, we both have sonnet crowns in this book. That thing, they took me years to write. So antithetical to how do I write. It took me years to write this sonnet crown, which is like a bunch of poems where the last line is the first line of the next poem. But it did kind of teach me something about repetition that I wasn't doing in my normal poetic process, if that makes sense.
Other questions in the room?
So yeah, thanks so much. Like I loved all of those poems. I thought they were fantastic. Like, so thank you, first of all. And secondly, I was going to say, so I remember reading, Megan, your last book, Good Boys, and one of the things that I remember striking me a lot about it was how well it kind of like flowed as a sort of singular book, and it wasn't just sort of like one poem to another poem and stuff like that. So what I was just curious about, maybe it's a boring kind of practical question, but like when you've got all of the poems that you've written, like how much is this for both of you, like how much are they conceived as whole books, or how much are they just sort of like one poem after another poem, and then you just sort of like shuffle them around in order to create a complete work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm so curious about your answer because so with my first book of poems, the latter process that you described of I write one poem and then another poem and another poem and another poem, and they just shuffled around and shuffled around and shuffled around, and then it's a book. I mean, that is exactly the process of my first book of poems. What was it for? Like that, and that was what I think I had learned through the time I did my MFA and the place I did it. That was what I had learned was, how do you put together a book of poems? You write lyric poem, and then you write another lyric poem, and then you write another one, and then you write another one, and then you write a whole bunch of them, and then you cut 90% of them and you write some more again, and then you are like in workshop with people and you workshop them, revise them, and you like figure out what your strongest ones are by virtue of they're accepted by a prestigious literary journal. And then you write some more, and then you're like, oh wow, I'm gonna write this one because like I'm gonna put that one at the front of my book because the X literary journal, to speak to your hyper professionalization, accepted it, and that makes me feel great about myself because I then submit like hundreds of other poems that all get rejected anyway. Like, I'm saying this because I think there's something really like useful in the like compose one poem without thinking of it as a book. I think there's something incredibly like necessary about that. I think like for me, like if I try to like think of like how does this fit into a book, that's another like sort of what John Berryman calls the thinky death. It's just like that's the way that a poem can often die, of like, where does this go in my book? Well, then it doesn't have, what reason does it have to exist in the world on its own, and why am I like putting it into it? I want, so anyway, but that was like what I had been taught in school, was how to make a book of poems. And I think what was felt transgressive or different or raw, or at least like I was trying something new with this book, was like this a lot of the poems in this came out of an extended project where I didn't even know actually like where one poem stopped and one began. There were like poems that I had thought were 3 poems that I realized were just 1, or poems that I thought were 5 poems and I realized were actually 0 poems because they were all doing the, but like they kind of all connected to each other in a way that scared me, because I was like, I write nice lyric poems that begin and end and begin and end and begin and end. And I'm like, whoa, this is not what's happening to me anymore. And then I just decided, or the way that I realized that had to take me was I was going to like totally lean into that and be like, you know what? Well, if I don't really know what's a poem or not, I'm going to like work with an illustrator and make paper dolls in this book. And I was also like, I do a lot of work, or I do a lot of work with crossword puzzles. So there's a crossword puzzle. I'm trying to flip to it, but you know what a crossword, there's a crossword puzzle. It's not a French mot croisé, which is an American style crossword puzzle that's sitting in this book. Here's the answers to it, or here's the crossword puzzle. There's like a Wikipedia article. There's a quiz. I was like, you know what? I am going to like try to kind of like just explode my own boundaries of what do I even feel like is a poem, because that felt so deeply uncomfortable to me. I was like, yeah, we're gonna like go into that. And that I think that was important to me, and kind of like realizing what the shape of a book was, and like trying to move from, okay, I've put together a collection of lyric poems that emerged over a decade, into what does a book even look like?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. I'm going to answer it super honestly, which is to say that sometimes you write the whole book and then you're like, how to talk about all these things together, unless it's a project book, which I detest, honestly, because I think that when we make things too intelligible, then we are trying to sort of like, in a way, make it something that can be marketable. And I think that also we're sort of in this moment where like a lot of poets, like writers in general, have to like kind of answer to the zeitgeist, and the ceiling of the zeitgeist is super low. And therefore, like, how imaginative can you be when you're constantly like answering to this thing that's really low? And so like I was very like with this book, I'm like, this is a book of love poems and revenge poems. It's not solving anything. It's not making any sort of geopolitical moment. Like Good Boys was like kind of this ragey book where like there was something political and kind of like politically obvious in like the movement of those poems and the way like they were sort of what they were trying to do. And I think it was Cave who read the book, and he was like, Meg, like, it's a ferocious book. It's a great book. He's like, the anger is always so sure of itself. It walks into the room and it doesn't ask questions. And I'm like, I kind of wanted this book to be walking into the room and asking questions. So it's sort of like a chatty, like philosophical book about like love, desire, gender. But that's like, on the other hand, like I think that to talk too much about like what makes a collection, like to me, a collection is just time. All it is what you were going through from 2015 to whatever. It doesn't have to be chronological time. It can be like you lived your life in flashbacks for a year, which during the pandemic maybe we did. But like temporality governs collections, I think, more than thematic issues do. Themes belong to like the publicists. Time belongs to like poets. That's my answer.
We'll take one more question since we started late and I saw that hand go up first. So I'm sorry, it's going back here. Sorry.
I'm going to put you both on the spot, and it's actually the right question for the end. Can you both recite a poem or a piece of a poem from the canon that just is your favorite or moves you or inspires you or is what always makes you sigh, or, the thing that gets you going?
Yes, I think it's been like a really long time. And it's by Dickinson, which is insane. But like I actually don't know if I can do it. So let me say, okay, will there ever be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? Could I see it from the mountains if I was tall as they? Does it have feet like water lilies? Does it have feather like a bird? Does it come from a famous country of which I've never heard? Oh, scholar, oh, sailor, oh, wise man from the skies, please tell a little pilgrim where the place called morning lies. And actually, she's not bad now that I'm saying it. She needs speed, But yeah, that's my, it's like Dickinson is in my head, but also I'm always fighting with her. Yeah. Good question, though. I think, yeah.
I have an Emily paper doll.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I like realized sort of like way after the fact. There's so many Emilys. There was, in Paris, there was this old New York Times article about like Emily, what a name. We all love Emily's. I have an Emily paper doll in here. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves, and gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borrow groves and the mom rats outgrave. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub bird and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the jabberwock with eyes of flame came blurring for the told you one girls as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker snack. He left it dead, and with his head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the jabberwock into my arms, my beamish boy? O frab just day, Kalu Kalei, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig in the side, he troves at gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the burrow groves, and the mome rats outgrave.
That was the most beautifully nerdy question, and also the most beautifully nerdy responses. I love that. That was amazing.